Before the days when the cottage became one of the happy places for Cynthia and myself, we tended to spend most of our vacations sort of bouncing from place to place, occasionally mooching a week at somebody else's cottage, but also frequently just putting up a tent someplace, a provincial park, or heading across the country. And so putting up tents was something that we had a great deal of experience with. And over the years, those tents ranged from ones that you could put up in probably not much more than a minute or two, to the kind that came with poles that were assembled from parts A through F and included an assembly guide that looked like the Saturday Star. But in a little reflection that I've read before on this particular Sunday, a lady by the name of Deborah Brunt writes about putting up an altogether different kind of tent, and one that just about anybody could assemble. The tent went up the week before school started. Megan and Amanda had erected it with a little help from me. We opened the card table and set chairs around it facing outwards. Then we covered the table and chairs with sheets and blankets. The end result took up most of the den. All week long, the girls played in the tent. And then came the morning when Megan started second grade and Amanda began kindergarten. Dropped Megan outside the school and then escorted Amanda into her classroom. Amanda was eager for me to leave, eager to get on with the adventure of learning. So I drove home, stepped into the den, and stopped short in front of the tent. Suddenly I felt overwhelmed. Maybe it was the empty house. Maybe it was the bittersweet taste of change. Whatever it was, Deborah writes, it made her want to climb into that tent once again. And I wonder if there wasn't something similar going on in Peter's mind that day that he and John and James stood with Jesus on that particular mountain. In characteristic fashion, Peter blurts out the very first thing that comes into his head, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up a tent. Now, it's hard to say precisely what Peter was thinking. Luke tells us that he really didn't know what to say. Mark says that it was because he was terrified. And really, who wouldn't be? You've gone up into the hills with your rabbi, with your teacher. And as a result of the time that you've spent together, you've come to have some inkling that this one that you are following is more than just a wise man. You've seen how the power of God has been active in his life. And you've got to wonder, has he come into the world to break the centuries of prophetic silence? Has he come into the world to just restore the glory and the strength of Israel? Has he come to be the king that we are waiting for? Not that long before, Peter had blurted out that Jesus was the Messiah, the one that all of Israel had been waiting for. And Jesus had as much as told Peter that he was right on in his identification of who Jesus was. But then Jesus had begun talking about suffering, about death, about a cross. And now Peter was more confused than ever. But now they've come away to this mountain. And in the past, the mountains have been a place of prayer for Jesus, a place for him to catch his breath, a place for him to renew his strength for the demands of ministry. And Peter might have wondered, was this going to be another one of those trips? Whatever Peter might have imagined would happen, though, nothing could have prepared him for what actually did. Just as the 3 disciples were on the verge of sleep, Jesus began to shine. Shine like you would imagine that heaven shines, a white that was beyond white. Luke says that he was dazzling. And standing there beside him, seemingly in the role of counselors, were Moses and Elijah. Moses, who'd led the people out of Egypt. Moses, who had given the people the law. Moses, who'd now been dead for more than 1,400 years. And Elijah, foremost of Israel's prophets. Elijah, who'd been taken up bodily into heaven in a chariot of fire. Elijah, who was supposed to come again in order to prepare the way for the Messiah. That Moses and that Elijah were standing there on the mountain with Jesus. It's like the gates of heaven had been opened and Peter and the others were being offered the opportunity to take a look inside. But there's something more to what Peter says than just the fear that Mark mentions. Normally, fear is something that makes you want to run for the hills. But in this instance, Peter's strongest desire is actually to stay. This is good, he says. This is great. It wasn't just fear that he was feeling. This is excitement. This is wonder. It was the recognition that something vitally important was happening here. Later on, Peter would describe that moment in one of his letters by saying, "We were eyewitnesses of his majesty." And Peter didn't want to lose that. He wanted that moment to just go on and on and on. I know, Peter says, let's put up a tent. In other words, let's make this permanent. Let's just stay right here. Isn't that the way that we often respond to those great moments in life? Those enchanted evenings when you're out with someone special. Or those contented moments when you're surrounded by the people that you love. And isn't that the way that we react whenever change threatens to take that something special away? When the last of our children heads off to kindergarten, or when the last of our kids simply heads off and we're left with an empty nest, or when death starts to intrude on our circle of friends. Don't we long for things to just stay the way they are, or the way they were? Aren't there moments in life that we just like to see go on and on and on? And isn't that true of those life-changing moments in our relationship with God as well? Because of this very passage, we refer to those moments as mountaintop experiences. Those moments of remarkable clarity, those moments when everything that we've been hearing or reading or praying is suddenly shown to be real. Those moments when we feel God's closeness. Not because he isn't always there, but because so often we are way too distracted to notice. There are those moments when The grace and the peace of God come over us like a flood, and we know that we will never be quite the same again. Times when we would happily just put up a tent and stay right where we are. And I think that's precisely what Peter is feeling here. In so many ways, this was the high point of his life so far. And so Peter's first impulse is to simply just put up a tent and stay right where he is. Now, there was a time in the life of King David when he had that desire too. The desire to crawl into a tent. In Psalm 61, we hear David express that longing, "Let me abide in your tent forever." For David, though, it wasn't so much a desire to stretch out a wonderful moment. Rather, it was a desire to find shelter from the pressures and the changes of life. He was looking for refuge. He was feeling faint. And what he really wanted to do was to just step away from life for a little while. Step away and come into God's tent. Take shelter there, perhaps forever. And I think most of us have probably known that kind of longing as well. The desire to find a place of shelter in the midst of life's storms, a place of peace amidst the stresses and the strains of life, a place of security, a place of calm in the midst of life's constant change. And what better place to find that than in the tent of the Lord? I think there are times when, like David, all of us would like to be able to just step away from life for a bit and put it on hold. But back on the mountaintop, Peter isn't allowed to do that. He isn't permitted to put up this tent. Really, no sooner has he spoken than a cloud comes and overshadows them all. And for Luke, this is where the real terror begins. But then that cloud lifts and the whole moment is over. Moses and Elijah and Jesus' heavenly glow are gone. And this is one of the lessons that this passage has for all of us this morning, that life does not come with a pause button. And it doesn't come with a rewind either. As much as we might sometimes like to, we simply cannot put life on hold. We can't just stay where we are. We can't keep our children from growing up. There is no such thing as 39 and holding. Every today is followed by a tomorrow. And the only way that we can move in life is forward. Thankfully, in the midst of life, God does give us those incredible mountaintop experiences. He gives us those moments of bliss. He gives us those moments of clarity, those times when we're able to see the world the way that He sees it, those times when something of the brilliance of heaven comes shining through, and we could happily spend the rest of our lives just singing for the joy of it all. But what Peter and John and James discover is that in this life, the moment inevitably comes when you have to move on. When you have to leave the mountaintop behind and return to the valleys. Because it's in the valleys where the majority of life is actually lived. And it's not that Jesus doesn't delight in giving us the mountaintops. It's not that He doesn't share a longing for that day when together we will be able to dwell in the tent of the Lord forever. But He also knows that the time for that is not yet. The journey isn't over. As with young Amanda heading off to kindergarten, so much of the adventure still lies before us. And so, whether by word or by action, Jesus tells them that it's time to head back to the valleys of life. Because it's in the valleys that Jesus is needed most. And therefore the valleys are where he calls us to be as well. And so they go back. But those who come back down the mountain are not the same people as those who went up. They have been changed. They've been changed by what they've seen. They've been changed by what they've heard. Out of that cloud that brought the moment of wonder to an end comes the confirmation of everything that Peter and the others have been feeling about this man that they've been following. "This is my son, the chosen one," a voice from heaven proclaims. Listen to him. Heaven confirms for Peter and for us that Jesus is the word that God has spoken, that his voice is the one that we must follow. Jesus himself once said, "I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. The sheep follow the shepherd because they know the shepherd's voice." They know that he is their security, that he is the one who provides what they need. And this is the other lesson that this passage has for us. That our longing to find things like shelter and peace and security isn't fulfilled by crawling into a shelter made out of sheets and chairs. It isn't fulfilled by clinging to the past or by climbing up a mountain or even by hiding out in a pulpit or in a pew. In this life, the shelter and peace and security we're looking for come from staying close to the shepherd. In our longing for the glory of the mountaintop or the comfort of God's tent, the best place of all will always be for us to be with him. The Apostle John begins his gospel with the remarkable statement that the Word of God became flesh and pitched his tent among us. And, John says, we have beheld his glory, the glory as of a father's only son. And it makes you wonder whether John was thinking about that moment on the mountain as he wrote that verse. If he was remembering the glory that he saw that day, if he was remembering the words that he heard, but most of all, it makes you wonder if he was remembering the lessons that he learned, that the tent that we're longing for is not found in a particular place or in any particular moment. It's the one that the Lord himself has pitched in our midst, and the one that we share simply by staying close to him. Amen.